Before we go to the questions, though, I just wanted to make a small footnote, and that is that Tarsila is referred to as Tarsila because of her great iconic status, kind of like Madonna, I guess. And this, I wanted to underline that because, of course, we always refer to artists by their last names. However, in different traditions, they are referred by their first names. In the exhibition, for example, Pedro Américo, who is also a Brazilian artist, is known by his first name exclusively, not his last name as well. Just to be clear why Tarsila was Tarsila and Lauren Harris was Harris.
And also Tarsila signs Tarsila.
She herself.
Yeah, she herself.
Okay. Okay, so does anyone have any questions?
My question is about Tarsila, and just in the context of Lauren Harris, where he moves towards the last part of his career to this geometric abstraction. I don't recall seeing images of Tarsila's work after 1932, but she lives, what is she doing? Does she move, in a sense, back?
Yes, I chose not to show what she does after that because it's not worthwhile. She revisits her Pau Brasil phases, so she keeps on working with the same vocabulary, lakes, small lakes, and then small hills with some vegetation, houses, and maybe a mountain or two in the background, some palm trees. I mean, it's really something she keeps on doing, and without the same freshness as in the 20s. And also in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, she illustrates many books because her family lost most of the money. She had to work. She was from a very wealthy family, but in 1929 they lost everything. I mean, I don't know if everything, but I mean, she had to work to live. So she began in the 30s onwards. She did many illustrations, and even the illustrations she did for the books, you can figure out the drawings she did in the 20s, and she used them and added flowers and things, but it's the same basis. So I'd rather stay in the 20s.
Yes, the microphone is coming to you.
Thank you. Hi, thank you both for those really excellent papers. Sarah, I was hoping you could talk a bit about Harris's relationship to, okay, so we've talked a lot today about how landscape gets depicted as empty and what's actually people who live there, sort of resource extraction, et cetera, that's going on in the same places that are being depicted as empty. Can you talk about Harris traveling in sort of the north of Canada, and if he had any relationship to Indigenous people that were living there, or if he sort of talked about any of the land use that was going on already in the north, like mining and that sort of thing? Thank you.
That's a really interesting and great question, because the answer is sadly no. The Group of Seven, as iconic as they are in Canada, other than Emily Carr, who was not part of the Group of Seven, but was somebody who Harris identified her work in British Columbia. Her work is represented in the exhibition. She was deeply, deeply aware of what was happening to the Indigenous culture in British Columbia, and it became, it was the dominant focus of her painting and most of her life. For Harris and the other members of the Group of Seven, it's a sad story of them, I feel, almost being oblivious to what was going on, to really looking at the landscape in a kind of purity there, but not acknowledging that there existed anything before colonialism. So in many ways, that is, in the teaching of the Group of Seven, that is a criticism that is very fairly pointed out about their works, that you think about Canadian art in the 1920s and 30s, and there was such a lack of awareness there, other than with Emily Carr.
Thank you, Allie.
Thanks for the mic. Thank you both for really fascinating presentations. And I think my question, probably both of you could speak to it, but I'll ask Sarah, building on the comment just before mine, I was really struck by your discussion of Harris's relationship with O'Keeffe and relationship with the Southwest at a moment when in the United States, modernist artists are increasingly looking to an idea of an indigenous past, of a pre-colonial past, as a key to a kind of universal modernism that's very much informed by nationalism. So you mentioned O'Keeffe's writing on Hopi dances. It's also something that Marston Hartley, for instance, is looking at. And in a sense, you have a kind of a culmination or expression of this perspective in 1940, MoMA's exhibition of Indian art of the United States, which posits a kind of an American modernity as looking to a past, to a pre-colonial past, and indigenous forms. And I just wondered if you see a connection in Harris's looking at these artists, or more broadly, not to necessarily discuss primitivism as such, but what it might mean that modernity in relation to America, or the Americas at this moment, comes out of a look to a past, an imagined past, perhaps.
I think for Harris, his ties were, again, there's an irony because he spoke so strongly about not looking to European art, but Harris's strongest ties to abstraction were through theosophy, and I would say primarily to the writings of Kandinsky. And that was also something that he shared with O'Keeffe. In terms of looking to indigenous culture, I would say it just doesn't exist in his work, though he did, again, greatly admire Emily Carr, who veered toward an abstraction through her work, again, by looking to indigenous culture and wanting to create depictions of landscape, again, like the one that's in the exhibition here, where there was an almost enlivened spirit of the forest and so forth. But for Harris, I really think that Harris was looking, what he wanted to do was he wanted to move toward a pure geometric abstraction, more of a European type of ilk, but what he needed was a permission to do so, and I believe that permission came through this notion, which in some ways is a bit strange, of looking to the north as this source of spiritual flow. Like, I don't think, that's not the most popular and enlightened view that one might take, but it really, he was looking toward a sort of spirituality, but it was purely within the land, but not in terms of any sort of practice of indigenous culture.
Sarah, I wondered if you might mention, though, that broadly in Canada in 1927, the exhibition that was organized at the National Gallery of Art was an exhibition that brought together Northwest Coast Indigenous objects with modern painters. So there, in 1927, brought the Société Anonyme to Toronto, but also brought this exhibition, Native and Modern, at the National Gallery.
It was done through Eric Brown, the director at the National Gallery of Canada. So certainly there was an awareness, but not the sort of awareness that I think we have today. And I think in some ways, Lorne Harris was he was very progressive in the fact that he wanted to encourage painters and artists to look to the future. But I don't think that he was that progressive in terms of looking to Canada's history pre-colonialism.
Thank you both for absolutely fascinating papers. And just to add a little to what Sarah said, it's very difficult for us today to accept the accepted wisdom of the 1930s that Indigenous peoples could not survive in modernity. In Canada, there were these, in the US, there were these policies aimed at assimilating people. And I think most artists, although they might have had a sentimental sympathy and an interest, probably shared the view that there was just impossible for their quote-unquote more primitive technological cultures to survive. But I want to actually, I've been trying to understand the comparison with South America and Brazil in this context, and my own ignorance, but I'd really like to ask what parallels or differences there are in Brazil or elsewhere in South America in terms of the representations of black people in those paintings were very striking. They looked sort of folkloric to me, and happy, innocent people populating these scenes. But unlike Canada, you couldn't have thought in Brazil that there would be some sort of disappearance of black people because the population is so large. So what kind of representation is that exactly in terms of Brazilian history?
Thank you for your question. It's a very, very good question. I think it's quite complicated because, first of all, our Brazilian modernism looks very, very, very few modernists look at indigenous production. I mean, they don't study indigenous representations. Well, there are only very few cases. On the other hand, by that time in the 1920s and 30s, the black people were being incorporated, let's say, to Brazil as Brazilians as well. The former slaves and their families and their descendants were being looked at. And in the 30s, I'd say this mixture of races began to have a positive rather than a negative status. But it's complicated because I think Tarsila, her representation of black people is extremely naive because there's never any conflict. You don't see at the hillside, for example, any sort of conflict. Everything is always very pink and cheerful. She has some representations of angels, and they are mestizos, but they have blue eyes. So I don't think Tarsila does her job. I mean, as we would do today, she doesn't think about that. For her, it's. I think she sees the world in a very unpolitical way. I think she's quite naive, and I think that's because her education was so French, and so, she wasn't really engaged. She went to Russia in 1931. She loved communism. She wrote to her family saying that she was really impressed with the schools and the hospitals, and she really was impressed by what she saw in Russia. But when she came back, she was in prison because she had been in Russia. Not immediately afterwards, but say 6 months afterwards, she arrived. She stayed 1 month in prison. and I think that was it for her. So she had an engaged, very small engaged phase where she depicted poor families and orphans, but that was 2 years, and she had enough of that after prison. She didn't want to mention it anymore. So it's a time when indigenous people are left apart. They're not included as Brazilians, and black people begin to be integrated in the society, but in Tarsila's view, as very tame inhabitants and very unpoliticized point of view. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's one more question.
It's okay. Hello? Yeah, more or less about the same, but regarding Rockwell Kent. That in his trip to Tierra del Fuego, he basically depicted a landscape without people. And he entered in relations with and the book is dedicated to them, with the very big landowners that were the same guys involved in Indian hunting 15 years before his visit. And a couple of years before, in 1921, 1922, his visit is, I think, 1923, there was a very big massacre that was popularized by Patagonia Trágica, a series of books and movies. So that also were responsibility mainly of the people he met there. And even as he was a socialist in the narrative of the travel, he doesn't enter in any description of working conditions or indigenous situation there. But at the same time, he was trying to portray a real American landscape. And years after that, he began to build this idea of V for Victory during the Second World War, linking Greenland, Tierra del Fuego, and Alaska, that were his travels. So I was thinking, how was this relation of trying to portray a real American landscape that resulted in his categorization as an American after World War II, that if there's any relation with Harris in terms of looking for a real national landscape or a real American landscape emptied of people, with this later idea of the un-American activities.
I think that both Kent and Harris were very much looking for a real American landscape, and it was just different ways to do it. And I think in large part that's because Harris's vision was so focused on abstraction. And really, not unlike Tarsila, Harris really wasn't a political artist. He was an advocate, and he was a real promoter, and he was passionate about leading a new direction for both Canadian art and American art. But in terms of taking a hard look at the social issues that were going on, that's not what his art was about. So I think, in many ways, and I think this applies to Tarsila's art as well, that so much of what we are talking about is that there was this movement in the 1920s, and you see it in the exhibition and the paintings of Charles Sheeler, that there was a strong approach to moving away from the European Academy. And I think that is the common link between Harris and Tarsila. It's interesting, your comparison to Léger, because there definitely is a tie there. But again, with Harris's work, it wasn't like he was entirely divorced from all other influences as well. But I really think that, in Canada, Canadians spend a lot of time looking at a depiction of art as distinct from America. But what was interesting about the time that Harris was painting is that it was not about being distinct from America. It was looking across the ocean and saying, okay, we are distinct from the European academies. And I think that's what ties our two artists together.
Thank you very much for hanging out with us in the Americas today.